First of all, Dr. Song, thank you so much for your time in this interview today.
Yes, thank you for inviting me.
I think we have to start off with the target growth rate. It's been cut from 3.7 to 3.3%. First question, why did the government decide to go ahead and cut this?
The Korean government lowered its expectations for a GDP growth rate from 3.7% to 3.3%. The main reason for lowering is the expectation, its forecast, is that the global economic stagnation, mainly due to the Eurozone debt crisis. Eurozone debt crisis is very serious right now, and then Eurozone debt crisis not only affects the European economy, but also affects the emerging market or emerging economies, because mainly emerging economies growth depends on the demand from the advanced nations such as Eurozone. So the demand from the advanced nations will reduce due to the Eurozone debt crisis. So that kind of events will affect the emerging markets exports. So Korea's exports will be affected by the Eurozone debt crisis very negatively. So that's why the Korean government changed its forecast for GDP growth rate.
Even with this lowered target, what's the possibility of us not even reaching that? So maybe Korea being in the 1 to 2% range?
I think that 3.3% still looks rosy because it is based on the assumptions that Eurozone debt crisis will not worsen, and in the second half the global economy will show kind of a modest recovery. But we don't know the future of the Eurozone debt crisis. Right now, Greece has a new government, and then Spain got bailed out, and then there are several short-term solutions for Eurozone debt crisis were agreed in the European Union summit meeting last month. But the possibility that the Greece will default abruptly and exit Eurozone is still high. And then the Spain's banking sector is very weak. So it could be worse, and the Eurozone debt crisis might expand in the second half of this year. If it happens, we could watch the Korean economy will have a kind of a 1 or 2% GDP growth rate. That's possible.
So you pinpointed a lot of these uncertain areas coming from Europe, and so the Korean government is warning that we may have more uncertainties to look at for this year. Aside from Europe, are there any other reasons for this kind of uncertainty, or is that the main one?
There are external uncertainties and the internal uncertainties, but the internal economy right now, the Korean economy looks good. It's not in a bad shape. If we look at the macroeconomic variables such as consumption, employment, and industrial production and investments, these indexes are not bad. So right now it looks okay, but there are several problems like household debt problem, and then other uncertainties in the internal economy. Other uncertainties in the external economy is like, as I already mentioned, Eurozone debt crisis, and then the U.S. economy is growing moderately right now, but the labor market condition in U.S. is not good, and then and Chinese economy is not in a good shape. So there are several external uncertainties, and then it could be worse or it could be better, but we don't know.
Right. You brought up a lot of points, and I'm going to dig a little deeper into them. But you mentioned China. Not only China, but a lot of the emerging economies, like, for example, the BRIC nations, we're seeing Korea's trade with them starting to fall as well. So some economists are saying that this is definitely something to be a little bit concerned about. What are your thoughts on that?
And since global financial crisis broke out in 2008, Korea's trade or Korea's exports are mainly dependent upon the growth of trade with China and other emerging economies. But right now, the Chinese economy, let's look at the Chinese trade data. China's exports increased 8.6% in this first half of this year, and then imports increase is 6.2% this first half of this year. But usually the annual increase of exports and imports in China is double digit, more than 20%. So the Chinese economy and China's trade is a little bit stagnant. So China is the Korea's major exporting partner,
Right.
in the exporting market, and then global economy is not in a good shape. The global economy is stagnant, and then the Chinese economy is stagnant. So that affects the Korea's trade and exports and something like that. In addition to China, Brazil, India, and Russia also performed worse than last year or several years ago. So right now, the Korea's main trading partners, like except advanced nations, diversified markets like BRICS market is not in a good shape. So that's why the Korea's trade will be slower than expected.
Now, you said China is Korea's #1 exporting trading partner, and that's why when we saw the key interest rate drop this is the second time in less than a month for China, so a lot of people were a little bit concerned with the slowing growth of the country and how it will affect Korea as well. But aside from trade with developing nations, what about FTA nations? We saw EU and US, we have the FTAs with these two countries, and though there are positive effects, some of the manufacturing and service industries are suffering. What are your thoughts on that?
FTAs with US and EU is helping Korean economy, I think, right now. So because European economy is not in a good shape, so the European market is not good, but a lot of products which get benefit from the FTA is performing very well in the European market and the U.S. market too. But there might be several sectors that are hurt by FTA in Korean economy.
How can we fix that?
But it's very hard to find what kind of sectors and what kind of manufacturing and services are hurt by the FTA. It is too soon to say that, but we could fix that by the Korean government is preparing for the compensation program for the sectors that will be hurt by the FTA, and then there is a Trade Adjustment Assistance Act in the Korean for agriculture, manufacturing, and services, and then I think that might work if it happens.
What about within Korea, or just generally speaking, what are some booming or emerging industries that we should keep our eye out on for the second half of this year?
It's very hard to say that, it's very hard to predict what kind of sectors or what kind of industries will perform better in the second half of this year. But there are some assumptions for this kind of prediction. First of all, Eurozone debt crisis will be stabilized, and then U.S. Federal Reserve Bank might adopt expansionary monetary policy, and then China also has adopted expansionary monetary policy, like lowering interest rates, something like that. In that case, I think that capital goods such as steel, chemical, or semiconductors, like Korea's major exporting goods or exporting sectors, will perform very well in the second half of this year. But let's look at China. China is right now adopting the policies like lowering interest rates. That means that Chinese government is pumping the money into the market, and then I think that will boost the consumption of China. So in that case, consumption goods sector will perform very well, such as cosmetics.
Consumption and investment, these things are expected to be very strong in the domestic market, but with all the economic uncertainties that you mentioned for us, what is the possibility that they will bring down demand and bring down consumption?
First of all, private consumption increased 1% the first quarter of this year, which is very good, and then sales of durable goods grew moderately, and then private consumption, including retail sales, is very good in this half of this year. So the reason why the consumption is good is that the environment for consumption is very good. For example, employment growth is very stable, and then price level is very stable. Inflation rate is less than 3%. But there are external and internal uncertainties like Eurozone debt crisis and household debt problem. But if these kind of problems will worsen, I think that consumption and investment in the second half of this year will be limited.
I have some figures here. The government forecast from earlier this year that the local economy, they would add about 280,000 jobs to the market, but actually that target was raised to 400,000 jobs. Is this feasible? How realistic would you say this is in achieving?
I think that despite the economic slowdown for 2 years, the labor market has been very good in Korea. So employment creation or job growth is appeared in the service sector, such as the healthcare service sector, and then wage growth has been very low recently. So these two factors attributed to the creation of good job creation. So I think that this year we could have kind of 400,000 jobs will be created. But in the second half of this year or next year, I think that the job growth or employment growth will be limited because of the employment growth is kind of a lagging indicator of economy. So we are experiencing kind of economic slowdown that will affect employment growth, but it will happen in the next year, I think so. So 2013 employment growth will be less than this year's employment growth.
So compared to some other countries, right now anyway, employment-wise, Korea's not doing too bad, it sounds like.
Yeah, Korea is doing very good, I think, in the employment
well, that is
labor
good
market.
news. Well, as we're now pretty much at that midpoint mark for this year, a lot of people are definitely curious about what the second half looks like in terms of the economy. Thank you very much, Dr. Song, for shedding some light for us today.
Thank you.